Hello, my name's Michael Kinsey, and in this talk I'm going to give an overview of some research that myself and other co-researchers have done, looking at cognitive biases within decision making during fire evacuations. The work's inspired by a book I read by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2002, called Thinking Fast and Slow. I highly recommend reading this book if you're even moderately interested in understanding about how people make decisions. It's a really good book. The research I'm going to present is a product of a culmination of work by a number of researchers. Myself from Arup, we have Steve Gwynn from Canada, and in RC we have Erika Kuligowski from NIST, and we have Max Kineteder from Dartmouth College. Now, your brain is an amazing tool. It's able to make decisions very quickly, take in lots of information, and make quite good decisions or perfect decisions very well. But if you think about this in the context of how many other choices you probably have in most decisions, it becomes even more impressive. There are almost infinite ways that you can actually make the wrong or bad decisions. But your brain is really good at honing on what's good or what's right for you. This said, your brain can make mistakes or can make the wrong decision, and this normally happens for one of two reasons. The first reason is there's finite resources for you to make the decision. So there's limited time, you have limited mental ability to process the information, or there's just limited information in general. Now, that aside, even if you have all these resources at hand for a decision, you can still make mistakes, and this is often due to imperfections in the decision-making process. And we can make mistakes just by the manner in which we process the information, and this can be caused by something called cognitive biases. Now, during everyday decision-making, perhaps the consequences of making a mistake or a bad decision are not that great, but if we're in a fire evacuation, then the consequences can potentially be disastrous. So the purpose of this research is to address how we make mistakes, and through cognitive biases within the decision-making process within fire evacuations. I should also highlight that cognitive biases can actually sometimes help make a better decision. So we're trying to remain slightly impartial within the research, and to say that it's not necessarily a mistake, although quite often the concept of cognitive biases can cause mistakes. So to give a general examples of potential cognitive bias, I've got three quite well-known examples, and three questions here that I'd like you to have a think about the answers to. You don't have to say them out loud. The first question is: a bat and ball costs £1 10p. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, if you have a think about that, a common mistake people make here is they say, well, the bat costs £1, the ball costs 10p. Now, the actual answer is the ball costs 5p, the bat costs £1 5p. What people commonly overlook here is that the bat costs £1 more than the ball. So you can't have the bat equals £1. Question 2. If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long will it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Have a think about that. Now, a common answer people give is it will take 100 minutes. The reason for this is that people see 5 machines, 5 minutes, 5 widgets. They see 5, 5, 5, so they think 100, 100, 100. But actually, if you think about it, the answer is actually 5 minutes. One machine takes 5 minutes per widget. Now, again, don't worry if you've made a mistake here. This has nothing to do with your intellectual capability. This is more to do with the way in which you think about decisions, and to be fair, it's about being slightly careless with thinking about the answers. Your brain wants to move quickly to an answer, so it looks at patterns and then it looks to reinforce why that pattern is correct. They've answered some of these questions to Harvard and Yale graduates in the US, and over half of them got the answer wrong. So it's nothing to do with intellectual capability. Question 3: which central line is longer? Have a look at the two lines, one on the top, one on the bottom. Which one is longer? Now, your brain naturally tends towards saying that the top one is longer, and we think this is because the lines protruding out of either side, the prongs as it were, perhaps give the impression that the top line is longer. But actually, if you look at both of them, the central line is actually the same in both. So these are examples of when you've got all the information you need, you've got enough time to process it, and you've probably got enough mental capacity to answer these questions, but your brain is still making mistakes. And this is due to biases. So before I talk about evacuations and cognitive bias, I want to talk a bit about general decision-making theory. So your brain makes decisions as if employing two types of system. The first system is the automatic system, or system 1, and the second system is the reflective system, system 2. The automatic system functions non-consciously, so you're not aware that it's actually functioning. It's a very fast system, it can make decisions very quickly. It's what your intuition is driven by. It also is quite effortless to use. It actually saves energy. It functions by association, so for perhaps looking for patterns or things just built into your brain that you've perhaps learned over time. It's what's responsible for controlling senses and environmental awareness, so it's constantly always on. Even when we sleep, it's constantly on. And as a consequence of all these really great traits, you prefer using it, and you use it for most of your decisions. Most of your decisions throughout everyone's life is normally non-conscious. And when I talk about these aren't major decisions, I'm talking about perhaps small types of decisions like whether to go left or right, or choose to do something or not in the immediate vicinity. Examples include speaking, reading, walking a familiar route, eating. You're non-consciously thinking about these things when you're doing them. The second system is the reflective system. Now, by contrast, this is much slower. It occurs in our conscious, so it's when we actually focus on thinking about something, and as a consequence, it typically functions using rules or systematic approaches, step-by-step approaches. We are aware of it, and it's quite effortful. If you concentrate on thinking about something, we can only really do it for a short period of time, so it's hard to maintain. And examples of this include learning a foreign language, navigating an unfamiliar route, or solving a complex maths problem. Now, when we make decisions, quite often we'll either use one or the other, or sometimes we can use both or switch between the two. Now, a good example to demonstrate both systems is shown here by the Stroop test. Now, what I want you to do here is just read what the word says. If your native language is English, just read the English. If it's Chinese, you read the Chinese. So here I'll show an example. So green, blue, red, black, yellow, purple. Now this is an example of the automatic system working. My brain sees the pattern of the words, and then it says, right, read green, read blue, and I'm not consciously aware of it. If I do a similar exercise, but instead of read the word, I say the color of the word. So here we go, purple, red, blue, black, purple, green. Now I can still do that task, but my automatic system reads the word first, and my reflective system has to stop myself automatically reading the word, because that's the thing that comes naturally, and then I have to say, no, I need to read the color. So I can do this task, but I do it slower. So these demonstrate the automatic and the reflective system working. Now, within that sort of framework of using these two types of decision making, we can use heuristics. Now, the world is a complex place, and we often need or prefer to simplify decisions in order to solve them or to actually make them. So one of the ways we can do that is using heuristics. These are shortcuts or simple rules of thumb whereby we simplify a problem into something more simple for us to manage. We can develop these rules either just by learning them from other people or from formal rules, or by repeat experience. We often use them when we have complete information or knowledge to make a decision, or we have limited time to make a decision. We can also develop them over known well-performing rules. Now, the concept of heuristics, it uses simple rules of thumb, and often these can involve the use of something called substitution, whereby we substitute a difficult question for a more simple, manageable, familiar decision. And these can occur in both the reflective and the automatic system. So to give you some examples here, if I were to ask you how much would you contribute to saving endangered species, perhaps you would give me an answer, but perhaps you would actually think in your brain, how sad do I feel when I think about dying dolphins, or any animal. If I were to ask you how happy are you with your life, this is quite a complex problem as well, so you might choose to simplify this and say, what is my mood right now? Am I happy right now? If we think more in line with fire emergencies, if I was to ask you how long would it take to evacuate your office building, again, it's not a simple question, but you might instead give me the answer to how long does it take me to leave the office each day. So you'll do this process non-consciously as well, so you won't necessarily be aware that you're doing this substitution. So cognitive biases can occur in decision making where information is inappropriately processed or overly focused upon, often at the expense of other more relevant information, which can lead to an inappropriate decision being made. Now, these commonly occur in decision making involving the automatic system and when we use heuristics, though these can occur during any decision making process in theory. Commonly we come across cognitive biases where decisions need to be made where there is too much information, not enough meaning, we need to act fast, or we're not quite sure what we would remember. It's to do with memory. Now cognitive biases can be extremely common, and you're likely to experience multiple cognitive biases every day, and you're probably not aware of them. So to work through some examples, availability bias, which is a really common bias. If you were to ask someone immediately after a major fire incident, which was well covered in the media, are buildings safe during fires? They're likely to be impacted by seeing all these, perhaps newspaper articles or online web articles of seeing fire, a massive burning building. So they're more likely to say that perhaps buildings aren't safe during fires. And this is perhaps neglecting the fact of looking at the statistics of fire, saying actually it's still incredibly rare. This image is in their minds, so they're automatically skewed in how they think about something. Anchoring bias. This is whereby we anchor towards or tend towards a specific value or thing because we've initially been primed with that thing. So an example here is, do you think Einstein was older or younger than 100 years old when he died? Have a think about the answer. After answering that, so it should be yes or no, then the second question, how old do you think Einstein was when he died? You're likely, he actually died when he was 76 years old, but the answer, being primed with the initial question of greater or younger than 100 years, people on average will tend towards giving answers that are closer to 100 years. So you're anchoring towards a given value. Halo effect. This is whereby someone has a particular positive trait, and people tend to think that because of that they're able to have positive traits in other things perhaps not related to their positive trait. So for example, people dressing well, you get this in interviews. If someone dresses well, they perhaps graduate a prestigious university, they're actually you're more likely to subconsciously think they're actually competent in doing something perhaps they've never even done before. Also, it's interesting to note that people who are generally good looking or attractive, there can be almost a halo effect here whereby people think that they're naturally good at doing other things as well. Also, being in a position of authority, if you have your manager, you're used to your manager making good decisions hopefully all the time, you're more likely to think they'll make a good decision in something they've got no qualifications with. These are all to do with halo effect. Optimism bias. This is when we sort of neglect the actual risks of something and are generally optimistic about something happening. So a common one is believing it's okay to eat unhealthy food if you exercise after. Now to some extent that might be a little bit true, but actually it's often very hard to exercise off certain bad food very quickly. People who just got married believing they won't get divorced. When in the Western world, I think the divorce rate is about 1 in 2. But you ask any married couple, do you think you'll get divorced? Almost none of them will say, yes, maybe we will. So optimism bias is very common. Now, there are potentially hundreds, maybe even thousands of cognitive biases. And Benson on the Better Humans blog has actually tried to categorize them into different types in this codex image, which you can see here. You can find it online. The web link's down below, and I highly recommend anyone who's interested having a look at it. It's a really interesting drawing. So that's sort of a general theory about human behavior, heuristics, and cognitive biases. What I'd like to do now is talk a bit about cognitive biases during fire evacuations. Now, cognitive biases can influence various steps or stages during general decision making, during fire evacuations. What we've done is we've reviewed literature associated with general cognitive bias and then tried to identify how we could link some of those cognitive biases to known behaviors within the fire evacuation process. And we've classified these according to stages of the protective action decision model, which Erica Kuligowski developed at NIST. The idea being that this can perhaps help guide how we could consider these biases within the within evacuation modeling or within fire engineering process. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just run through some of these cognitive biases that we've identified, and I'm not going to mention all on the slides. I'll mention one or two on each slide. So we've already talked about anchoring bias, but attentional bias, this is when we have a tendency to selectively focus on specific information due to reoccurring thoughts whilst ignoring other information. So you might have people looking at a computer screen during a fire and they're so focused on doing the work they're less likely to notice other things going on around them, perhaps within their visual field, such as smoke or fire. Also, if someone's walking through a building every day, they're focusing perhaps on the architecture and the actual layouts, the physical things, and their attention is neglecting the signage around them, the emergency signage, so that can influence their behavior during an evacuation. We have authority bias, so the tendency to do or believe things that a person in an authoritative position states. So choosing to follow the request of a manager in a company to not evacuate. Maybe they said, oh, it's probably a drill, carry on with your work. But that might not be the right thing to do. You may choose to follow an evacuation route that perhaps a manager or a member of staff has told you to do during an evacuation, purely because they're in a position of authority. You hope that they're and expect them to make the right decisions. We have bandwagon bias, so this is the tendency to do or believe things because many other people do or believe the same. So if you see a lot of other people evacuate via a given route, you're more likely to choose to do the same. We have default effect, which is very interesting. This is the tendency to follow a default option, and we think this may be one of the reasons people move towards the familiar in buildings. So it's a common, well-known type of behavior that people tend to try and evacuate via the entrance they came in a building, and we think this may be due to the fact that this is the default option for them. People don't want to make a choice, so they've actually decided my default way of getting in and out of this building is this route, and that's the one they follow. They almost don't make a choice. This is the route. And we think this can be the reasons why people move towards the familiar during fire evacuations. We've mentioned halo effect before. Illusion of control. This is a tendency to believe a person can control or at least influence the outcomes of an event that they clearly cannot. So an example might be there's a massive raging fire and someone picking up a fire extinguisher and trying to extinguish the fire, not fully thinking that they can control the fire and put it out, but not really understanding that perhaps the extinguisher is going to have little impact upon a large fire. We have a planning fallacy. So this is the tendency to underestimate task completion times. So this could involve perhaps underestimating how long it takes an evacuation of a high-rise building. So a person thinking, oh, it won't take me long to evacuate, I'm gonna carry on doing my work. This could potentially delay evacuating. Normalcy bias shares a lot of similar principles to optimism bias as well, and this is generally under the principle that you think nothing is very bad happening. Maybe if you hear an alarm, you think, it's probably nothing, it's just a false alarm. We've mentioned optimism bias previously, similar to normality bias I mentioned earlier. We have pseudo certainty effect, the tendency to perceive an outcome as certain whilst in fact it is uncertain. So choosing to evacuate the building because a person is certain that they are not personally at risk. So again, there's a lot of similarities here with optimism bias and normalcy bias, but it's slightly different. Believing something is certain, so you believe your level of risk is actually 0 or not. Also, we might say choosing to walk through smoke because you're certain that you can get out the other side. And lastly, we have unit bias. It is a tendency to want to finish a given unit of a task or in a given unit of time. So you might say if the alarm goes and you know you need to evacuate, so I'm just going to finish writing the last paragraph or last sentence in my report, or I'm going to wait a couple of minutes first, then I'm going to evacuate. You're biased to a fixed unit of work or time. So all of these biases we've identified in literature linked to known behaviours or expected behaviours during fire evacuations. And what we've done with all this is come up with this conceptual framework diagram, which you can see here, of how biases might influence different stages of the decision-making process. So here we have external cues or information that people receive. This is during a fire evacuation. This information is then initially assessed by the automatic system because that's always working, and then the automatic system decides, can I carry on with the automatic system? Maybe I'm familiar with something, or I know exactly what to do, I've been trained to do. Or if I'm not sure, it's ambiguous, I'm not quite sure what to do, then I might need to choose to use the reflective system. So if I carry on using the automatic system, this is often whereby people will match a pattern of from a past experience or what they've learned to do. If I use a reflective system, maybe they're ambiguous cues or you're not quite sure what to do. So this can involve asking a manager because you don't know what to do, or then asking the people around you, something like that. And then you go and take an action and the process carries on as you're evacuating. Then the information carries on coming to you, and you carry on making other decisions. So how can we use this within the fire engineering process? Well, it's interesting to think of fire engineers, certainly with regards to human behavior and trying to help people evacuate, as choice architects. And we create an environment, or are part of the design team that create an environment whereby people are required to make choices. So we're part of the choice architect team. This concept was proposed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in the book Nudge here. This is another really great book. Richard Thaler actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017 also. So this is a really great book. I highly recommend reading this also. Now, in the book, it basically purports to introducing the idea of nudges, and generally we know that people make better decisions when they are given a choice. They're not forced to do so, because often we want people to be flexible, and that the information they're given is clear, simple, and is presented at the right time. And as I mentioned before, the concept that we can use here is through something called nudges. Now, nudges are simple, cheap means to subtly increase the chances of people making better decisions and decreasing the negative or increasing the positive biases without inhibiting the options available. Of course, we could just force people to do things, but often we're trying to account for a variety of situations, and if you force someone to do something, often that can restrict them in being able to adapt to another situation. So often we like to use nudges. And to give you an example of nudges that people or design teams have actually come across in everyday situations, I've got some examples here. So the nudge on the left is of a urinal in a Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. What they did was, in the urinal, they actually put a sticker of a fly just on the urinal, and commonly what a guy would do is when they come in, they see the fly, it looks very realistic, they actually try and aim while they're weeing at the fly. What this had an effect of is actually reducing spillages onto the floor during the whole duration of the trials, and this was statistically significant. So they've actually adopted a similar thing in a number of airports now, whereby it actually decreases the amount of that needs to be cleaned up at toilet airports. This is a simple, cheap, cost-effective way to try and influence behaviour, but it doesn't force people to not spill their wee, I guess. The top right picture shows a escalator and stair, and what they wanted to do was increase the number of people that used the stair. One of the most effective ways they managed to do this was to make the stair like a piano, and I think the piano actually makes sounds as you go up it as well. So this actually was a novelty. It was quite a novelty, and people actually encouraged people to try and use the stair because it looks like a piano. And this had various health benefits of people getting increased exercise, etc. The bottom picture is of a pension registration form. Studies have been done in the US whereby a number of people were just accepting whatever pension they got given, and they weren't properly looking at the pension details. And this can be because the pension system can be quite complex, and people just didn't know what they were doing, so they did nothing. So one of the ways they decided to address this was to make the default options more favorable to the person. So the first thing they did was the default option was to opt into the pension scheme. Some people by default weren't opted in previously. Another thing they did was to make the default payment schedule higher for the pension scheme. Now, people weren't forced to do that. They could reduce their pension payments, but because the default option was higher, on average people just kept the default. This meant that by the time they retired, they actually had a sizable enough pension at the end of working. So again, this is not forced. People still had a choice, but it was nudged because of this default effect that we talked about a little bit earlier. The top right picture is of teacher bonuses. There was a study in Chicago whereby in the original system, after the end of a school year, teachers were paid a bonus if they achieved a certain level of performance. That was working okay, but instead the school switched it round so that all teachers at the beginning of the year were given their bonus, and then they were told, if you don't meet your performance objectives, you have to pay this back. Now this had an effect of increasing number of teachers which matched their performance targets. The reason for this is that we have a bias called loss aversion bias, and what this means is that you're more sensitive to losing something than actually gaining it, and the ratio is about twice as much. So if you have two systems, one where I offer to give you £100 and the other system whereby I say you have to I'm going to give you £100 now, and later you're going to have to give it back, you're less likely to want to give it back than to actually give up, be initially given that amount at the end. And this is due to loss aversion. We're more sensitive to loss than we are to gain. So there's some examples of nudges. So what are some of the nudges we can perhaps use in fire engineering when we're thinking about human behavior in fire? Well, one way is potentially utilizing escape stairs during normal usage to make them the default option. So you open up your escape stairs, instead of hiding them away, you try and make them, people use them during normal usage. This had the added benefit of actually having increasing exercise, and also it can make people more familiar with them. So again, we're playing with default bias here. The second one is influencing architectural design to make visible the entrances to protected stairs. Often the protected stairs is hidden away, perhaps hardly ever used during normal usage. So again, this can play on availability bias. If you're using a PA system in your fire alarm, when you're asking people to evacuate, perhaps highlighting that this is not a drill. Again, this tries to play on anchoring effect, whereby you may have had past evacuations where it was a drill. Displaying a message on computer screens when a fire alarm sounds. If everyone's looking at their computer screens, they're perhaps susceptible to this focusing effect. So if we try and flip that and show a message on the computer screen saying please evacuate, it tries to break this cycle of attentional bias. Within fire evacuation training of people, perhaps in office environments, there's a number of things we could do in terms of nudges. We can prompt managers to act as role models to do the right thing, so to actually prompt people to start evacuating, to evacuate promptly, and to not perhaps collect their belongings when they evacuate. And people, and this effectively can rely on authority bias in people's decision making. So that's how we might, some nudges that we might consider within human behaviour in fire to try and mitigate or use some of our cognitive biases. Now, as fire engineers, in our day-to-day work, we can be just as affected by biases. And this is perhaps particularly the case because most fire engineers are all very busy and perhaps don't have huge amounts of time to make all the decisions. And this is particularly true for senior staff who perhaps heavily rely on their past experience and intuition, probably utilizing the automatic system and heuristics. So potential cognitive bias that may occur within the general fire engineering process are things like anchoring bias. So perhaps you've worked on a problem on a given project, focused on one aspect of the design maybe, and then on the next project you overly focus on that aspect of the new building. So it's coming down to anchoring effect, possibly even availability heuristic as well. And this is not necessarily a problem, but if you do this at the expense of other information you should be looking at, then it can cause a problem. Halo effect, trusting certain people to not do a job, to do a job, potentially not checking it thoroughly. So a lot of people when you work with, you get to identify, oh, there's some really good people I really like to work with, and then if you give them work to do, perhaps you're less likely to review it as thoroughly because you kind of trust them in some ways, and this can make you perhaps miss certain things when you're maybe reviewing their work. Confirmation bias, only looking to confirm your own ideas in the face of very junior staff, and perhaps not fully thinking about a problem impartially. This is potentially very common in everyday life. Confirmation bias, we only look to seek what we believe, and it's very hard to step out of the pattern and to an extent admit that you might be wrong. Default effect, perhaps I'm doing some modeling and I use the same default input parameters for the model because I've used them before, without thinking, and this could be at the expense of without thinking about the specific nature of the building I'm actually designing. We have authority bias, so trusting perhaps what a project manager or project director says because they are usually right, or maybe just trusting what your manager says because they're usually right, without critically actually thinking about an issue or thinking, oh, maybe I must be wrong somewhere. We have status quo bias, so this is perhaps particularly true in meetings where perhaps a senior member of staff says something and no one else says anything, so you're more likely to think, well, no one else has said anything, maybe what I'm thinking is wrong. We have framing effect, so presenting all the reasons why a fire strategy should be accepted whilst giving less consideration to reasons it shouldn't. Again, this sort of overlaps with confirmation bias. You're thinking, yes, I've written this work, these are the reasons why it works, but perhaps neglecting the reasons why it might not work. And survivorship bias, perhaps thinking that all or most of the buildings we design have no fires in, so the way we design them must be acceptable. And this could be at the expense of looking at where fires have happened in other buildings and seeing how it could affect the buildings we're designing. Now, we're not saying that all of these occur. I'm saying they may potentially occur within the general fire engineering process. So how can we mitigate against these biases having a negative impact upon our work? Well, there are a few ways. The first way is to be aware that just being aware of the existence of the cognitive bias can help. Another way is to, when you're making decisions, try to slow down when you're making them. Don't try to make them quickly. Pause and think about what you're saying. And basically it tries to leave more time to kick in your reflective system if you think something might not be wrong. You can also provide incentives, offer rewards if person can spot an intentional mistake. Where I was going with this is thinking about where you have junior members of staff perhaps questioning more senior members of staff, trying to offset some of that authority bias. We could also, when we're looking at using default values for a given perhaps model, we can perhaps use default values that are conservative. Thereby, if people are going to use the default values, you'll always be doing a conservative design. And you'll often get very, I don't know, for example, in evacuation modeling, very high long evacuation times. This will prompt people to actually want to change the default values and thereby break the pattern and think about what they're doing. When we present information in fire strategies, perhaps looking at presenting critical information in a more easy to read, accessible format. So perhaps we might want to look at, instead of writing reports where someone has to go from top to bottom or search through for the information they need, looking at using something like IPDFs, which you can click on a menu option and then it takes you directly to the information. So it's easier. So it's going back to that concept of choice architecture, where we're trying to make it easier for a person to get to the information they need. And the last one is more general, just creating an environment where people feel comfortable and encouraged to provide constructive criticism with all is really great, because then it starts allowing people to think and to jump out of their pattern of making these biases. So in this talk, I've given an overview of the motivations for the research of looking at cognitive biases within fire evacuations. I've given an overview of general decision-making theory, presented some of the cognitive biases during fire evacuations that we've identified, and then given some examples of where they may occur in fire engineering, considering human behavior and the general process, and some ways in which we may look to mitigate them through things like nudges. Thank you very much.